What if you finally got everything you thought you wanted and still felt like something was missing? You have the career, the house, the relationship, the money, the vacations, and maybe even the family. So from the outside, your life looks good. Maybe people even look at you and think they've got it figured out. And yet, when you're alone with yourself, there is this quiet feeling that something isn't quite right. Something feels missing. And that can be one of the most confusing experiences in life. Because how do you explain feeling unfulfilled when you have so much to be grateful for? We've got a lot to talk about. Hello, everyone. And how do you say something is missing when technically everything is there? I've experienced that feeling myself. So I'm Kevlan and I work in the field of personal transformation. And for many years, I was focused on achievement, growth, understanding, and building a successful life. And there was a time where I genuinely believed that if I accomplished enough, learned enough, achieved enough, eventually I will feel fulfilled. But what I discovered changed the way I understood my entire life. Maybe the problem wasn't that I didn't have enough. Maybe I had been pursuing the wrong definition of enough. Think about how early we begin learning what a successful life is supposed to look like. We go to school when we're little and they say get good grades. And then after that, get a good job, build a career. And then we hear like we need to make money and we need to buy a house and we need to find a partner and have a family. And then we need to travel and get vacations and be successful. So that's all the things that we hear. And there's nothing wrong, inherently wrong with any of these things. The problem isn't the house, or it's not about the career, or it's not about the money. The problem is when we pursue these things without ever stopping to ask, do I actually want this? Or you could even ask yourself, do I want this because it is genuinely meaningful to me, or because I learned that this is what a successful life is supposed to look like? That's a very different type of question. Because when we can spend years climbing a ladder only to eventually realize that it was leaning against the wrong wall, and sometimes we don't even realize it. We just keep climbing another promotion, another achievement, another goal, another milestone, and every time we reached it, there is a moment of satisfaction. But then, and this moment of satisfaction can last differently for different people, but then it fades and we need the next thing, the next achievement, and then the next goal, and then the next version of ourselves. And eventually we start wondering, why doesn't any of this feel like enough? This is where we've misunderstood fulfillment. We've been taught that to think that fulfillment is something we go after we accomplished enough, as if there is some future version of us where everything finally comes together and then we will finally feel complete. But what if fulfillment doesn't come from having more? What if it comes from living in alignment with who you are? Because you can have a life that looks successful and still feel disconnected from yourself. You can sometimes be surrounded by people and still feel alone. You can be incredibly busy and still feel like you're not really living. You can accomplish things you once dreamed about and still wonder, is this really what I want? And I think that question deserves to be taken seriously. Not because you should throw your life away, not because you quit your job tomorrow, or not because you need to abandon everything you've built, but because sometimes dissatisfaction isn't telling you you need more. Sometimes it's asking, is this actually yours? I think there is a difference between achieving a life and experiencing a life that feels like your own. You can achieve success according to someone else's definition. You can become exactly who you were told you should become. You can make your parents proud, or you can impress your colleagues. You can build an impressive resume. You can create a beautiful life on paper and still feel disconnected from the person living it. because external success answers the question, what have I achieved? But fulfillment asks a different question. Does this life feel true to me? Those two things aren't always the same. So what does an aligned life actually mean? To me, alignment doesn't mean that everything in your life suddenly becomes perfect. It doesn't mean you'll never experience fear, uncertainty, or difficulty. And it certainly doesn't mean following every impulse or desire. To me, alignment means something much simpler. It means your life increasingly reflect who you consciously choose to be. Your decisions being coming from clarity rather than fear, from intention rather than habits, from your values rather than people expectations, from what genuinely matters to you rather than what you think you should want. And that's where a very powerful question comes in. If you had all the resources you needed, no financial limitations, no fear of judgment, no need to impress anyone, no need to prove yourself, no expectations from your family, no pressure from society, what would your life actually look like? Where would you live? How would you spend your time? Who would you spend it with? What would you create? What would you stop doing? And what would you finally give yourself permission to pursue? And I think the most important question is, who would you be? Because maybe the life you're living today is partly made of decision of you consciously made, and partly made of decision you never stopped to question. Belief you inherited, expectation you absorbed, ideas about success you accepted, fears you learned, identities you developed. And over time, those things can become so familiar that we mistake them for who we are. We say, this is just who I am. But is it though? Or is it who you've learned to be? That's a question that changed my life. Because transformation, at least the way I understand it now, isn't primarily about becoming someone new. It's about removing the layer that I have accumulated over time. All the expectations and the conditionings, the fears, the limiting beliefs that we have or that we've learned, the identities, the stories, and finally reconnecting with the person underneath them. The person who may have been there all along. And here is something I want to make very clear. If you're watching this and thinking, so does this mean I need to completely change my life? Not necessarily. This is not what I mean here. Perhaps you don't need to a new career, or you don't need to change your relationship or leave your relationship. You don't need to move to another country, or to sell everything and start over. But perhaps the first thing you need is simply to become more honest with yourself, to start asking better questions, to notice where you're living from fear, where you're living from expectations, where you're saying yes when something inside you is saying no, where you're pursuing something because you think it will finally make you enough, and where you might be ignoring something that genuinely matters to you. Because again, sometimes transformation doesn't begin with a dramatic decision. Sometimes it begins with a quiet realization. I don't think I want to live this way anymore. And then another, I think I want to discover what is actually true to me. So if you have a good life, but something still feels missing inside, I don't want you to immediately assume that something is wrong with you. You may not be ungrateful, or you may not need to achieve more. You may simply have outgrown a version of yourself or a definition of success that no longer reflects who you're becoming. And maybe that feeling you've been trying to silence, the restlessness, the dissatisfaction, that stuff that is missing, the question you keep pushing away, isn't your enemy. Maybe it's an invitation to stop for a moment, to question the story you've been living, and to ask yourself, if I wasn't trying to live the life I was taught to want, what life would I consciously choose? Because perhaps the goal isn't to build a more impressive life. perhaps the goal is to build a life that feels like yours. That's ultimately what led me to create my 21-day transformation program, Becoming You. It really to guide people through a process of understanding the patterns they've been living from, releasing what no longer serves them, and reconnecting with who they truly are, so they can begin creating from that place. Because I don't believe transformation is about becoming more. I believe it's often about removing what was never truly you in the first place. And maybe that's where your journey begins too. Not with the question, how can I become more successful? But with a much deeper question, what would it look like to finally create a life that is truly mine? If that question resonates with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Also, if you'd like to explore this work more deeply, I'll leave a link below where you can learn more about Becoming You, my 21-day transformation program. Thanks for being here. Subscribe to my channel. Like if you like this content, like the video, send it to your friends and family. And stay conscious, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.